As we all know, the world is falling apart, and then something like Swaraj, that perhaps I don't understand well, but something like Swaraj seems to be today the only path out of the horror. We are living really in a terrible moment, in a moment in which all kinds of violence, all kinds of evil is among us, is defining our lives. And then we are trying to find a way out of this horror. And we have discovered that it is very important not only to resist, but the resistance that can endure is the resistance that can create something new. That is the only possibility. And that in that creation of something new, the idea of constructing a we, and with that specific we, that means abandoning this construction of the individual, acknowledging that we are not signets of relations, that we can create their own way of living among them, among those constituting that we, and creating an openness to others to live in harmony with those that are different. This kind of confusion in which I am telling my connection with Swaraj, I would like to try to connect with three fundamental pillars of my life today. That is hope, friendship, and surprise. And these three elements, the pillars of the world in which I want to live, can have a very clear inspiration, and not only the Zapatistas, but particularly the Zapatistas and other indigenous peoples in Oaxaca, that are talking in that language of autonomy, perhaps don't describe exactly what we are trying to say. What we are trying to say is that we are rejecting very explicitly all kind of heteronomy, meaning others ruling our lives. We know that these rulers of our lives, the market, the state, the Western tradition, colonialism in all its shapes, has been destroying us, and it's at the point of destroying the life in the planet. We are rejecting that kind of ruling of our lives and ruling of our hearts and our beings and our stomachs. It is the ruling of everything through these principles, through these certainties. Then we are rejecting those principles, we are rejecting those certainties, and then in discovering our own ways of ruling our lives, we are discovering, first of all, that only can be done with a very solid we. That is precisely against the idea of the individual. We have the commonality with some other people. And with these we's, we are discovering how we can relate ourselves, this we, with other we's that can be radically different. Then we are trying to live in harmony with those that we cannot understand. Talking about dialogue for us, it's acknowledging that we cannot understand everything of the other. We can acknowledge the otherness of the other. But this otherness of the other does not imply that we need to educate them, to transform them in someone like me, like us, that we need to accommodate them in our own frame. Perhaps it is the option, it is almost ridicule to say it is connecting with the other heart to heart, because we cannot really connect mind to mind, because we are very different in mind, in beliefs, in a series of things that we have at the top of the head. Yes, then Swaraj is kind of resonate with our experiences in the villages, in the barrios, in the cities, with others, trying to create something that goes beyond modernity, beyond postmodernity, beyond all this stuff, all the series of certainties in which we were shaped before, and we are clearly suffering the consequences of being within that frame. And then to invent a new frame, to create a different frame, to create a different kind of world, Swaraj is perhaps the only path. in the 80s, that in Latin America was officially declared the lost decade for development, in which there was a collapse of all the different dreams about development, and the idea of post-development started to emerge. There was a group of people, a very important group of people, that suddenly discovered that the universal definition of the good life according with development, that is the way of life of the American way of life in the middle class, that was pretty stupid, that it has no meaning, it was not feasible. And then we started, the revelation was that we still had our notion of how to live well. Then instead of a new standard, then instead of development, we have our own notion. We discovered that there is 1,000 different definitions, or 1,000 or 1,000,000 different definitions of what is to live well. And then we were in that process of trying to rediscover what we are, what we are doing. We were just trying to redefine what we were looking for. When the people from Latin America, particularly the indigenous people of Ecuador, in Peru, indigenous people of those areas, started to use the phrase, the expression, buen vivir, living well. This immediately was co-opted by the institutions, and they started to say, oh yes, we have our own definition of the good life, and then we will put that in the constitution of Ecuador, and we will put that in the constitution of Bolivia. This is the new slogan, the new idea. But it was again transforming this idea of living well, buen vivir, in another form of development. What we are rejecting is any universal definition of the good life. When we are using the expression buen vivir, is not to have, now we have a different definition of what is the good life. We are saying people have different notions of what is to live well. And then what we need to do is to try to follow that inspiration, that possibility. We need to follow that possibility of the celebration of the diversity of ways of living well. Then for many of us, buen vivir is not slogan, is not one possibility, but it is the beginning of the celebration of many different ways of living well in the planet. I would say immediately that when you are talking about buen vivir today, we are immediately saying that any idea of living well that pretends to be universal is very pathological, is absolutely foolish. It does not have any meaning. How can be that we think that there is the same way of life in the Arctic, the Himalaya mountains, or the Sahara Desert? It is impossible. You cannot have the same definition of how is to live well in completely different environmental settings. But if you think, not only in the environmental settings, but in the cultural differences between different people, you cannot have any standard definition of what is to live well. Then for us, the use of buen vivir represents to respect and to celebrate the different ways in which different people celebrate life and define how they can live well. And acknowledging also that in any cultural group, you have different people thinking differently about what is to live well. That is not even the standard for any small village, a standard of what is to live well for everyone. That finally we need to respect, to celebrate not only the cultural differences, not only the different mentalities, but also the differences in the people, the persons, the families that have different notions of what is to live well. Then it is a very radical openness to the difference in the notion of how to live well or not.